I think what I've seen is, in terms of making reasonably significant shifts in people's regulatory kind of capability or thinking, has been exposure to prominent regulatory thinkers. And over the years, I think in New Zealand we've benefited from exposure to a number of those people from time to time. And there's a real sense of gaining knowledge quickly from being in a room where there's a discussion led by someone like Julia Black, for example, a few years ago. So I'd say that those sorts of things, while they seem costly at the time, if you get somebody to New Zealand who's a world-renowned kind of regulatory thinker, you can really boost the level of engagement, the discussion, the debate, and the knowledge quite quickly. I think there's a period, probably a decade or more ago, where you'd see the regulatory pyramid all over the place. And I think it's behind a lot of the things everybody still does, because as a concept I think it's pretty core. And at Maritime we were looking to reset our operating model around how did we think about the application of our regulatory task, if you like, and what would our framework be. I'd done the same thing previously elsewhere, and it had been done kind of in a room to the side with a bunch of smart people in a project sense doing it, and then handing it over the fence to the frontline people and saying, this is how you have to operate now. And it didn't really work. You know, those things have some impact, but they don't create lasting change. The Maritime example was where we got a bunch of people from different parts of the organisation, all with regulatory responsibilities, operational policy as well as the frontline delivery, and worked through a series of models that were being used in different places, either in New Zealand or internationally, and really discussed and debated what we could shape up that would work for Maritime at the time. And that was developed and put in place and built on and around by the people in this group that represented the people that actually then used it in their day-to-day work. And to me that was a much more successful way of shifting the operating model in the organisation and getting buy-in to it, because you had the people involved in delivering, shaping the way they were going to deliver. I think it's also, well, I know it's a principle that emerges from a systems thinking methodology, where in the kind of mantra is doing the work and improving the work is the work. You know, so you move on from the idea that as a frontline regulatory person, you do the work you've got to do with the tools that somebody else provided to you, and if they don't work, you go and ask them to improve the tools, and you wait for them to do that before you, and then nothing really changes because it's hard, you know. But if you're actually directly involved in making the change, you buy into it, you own it, and you kind of move forward with it. So I think there was an example of that. There's a huge amount of value in understanding that you're not alone in a regulatory context, and understanding that regulatory regimes are 80% the same and 20% the different, not the other way around. I think regulators generally like talking to each other and sharing their experiences and hearing about other people. And I think there's been a lot of value created over the last couple of 10, 15 years really, by having mechanisms in place that allow that and support that to happen. The mentoring that benefited me was not so much a structured mentoring program, but I benefited from having people that would spend time with me and put up with my endless curious questions about what everything meant and why we were doing things in the early days. When I made the transition from police to a regulatory role, suddenly you're almost out of the sort of law enforcement-based approach into the administratively manufactured regulatory system that sometimes stops or starts activities that aren't morally wrong, or we would normally consider as sort of enforcement type things. And I spent a lot of time in my early years really draining people of their information. And the patience that was showed for me, I think, has benefited me greatly. And there's half a dozen people that I always think about that I spend a lot of time with who really shaped the way I thought about regulation, and helped me to understand what to read, where to look, who else to talk to. The other thing that in the mentoring context, again not a formal mentoring program, was exposure to people in international jurisdictions. So New Zealand has a strong relationship across many regulatory domains with Australia, for example. So Australian ministerial councils, for me, consumer affairs, gambling, and constant exposure to experienced regulators from other jurisdictions, and noticing what is now obvious to me and has been for many years is that it didn't matter what regulatory domain you're working in, actually the fundamentals are pretty much the same. So yeah, I benefited greatly from that, and if I thought about my role as a mentor, I probably wouldn't describe it as that. I try to encourage discussion and ask questions and discuss and debate approaches based on whatever I think I might have learned over the years, and to help shape people's own approach. I think I'm not sure whether I'm drawing on my experience here and answering a question about how you approach a mentoring type conversation, or whether I'm drawing on what I might have read somewhere and should be doing. It'll be one of those things. I think it's always useful to ask people, how they think they should deal with it, and what are the key factors that are influencing the way they're thinking about it, and what are the alternatives, and what are the consequences of this compared to doing it differently, kind of thing. So arguably it's a bit of an analytical discussion. It's probably got elements of coaching as well, trying to draw from people their own thoughts and drivers for the approach that's being taken.